Yeah, well, I think it would be interesting just to get to the role of attachment in all of this, just because one element that we notice, and so in Buddhism, we're quite keen that the second noble truth, that all suffering ultimately stems from attachment. And I think one thing that seems to be missing, or as far as this, how to resist this creation of an interior world, is grasping at form, and it has a certain feeling which you can directly sense, and that's part of what we spend so much time attending to, is it feels like something to want form, and there's a sense of grasping at form, and to the extent that we're aware of doing that all the time and watch it, we always find that ultimately that's a source of suffering. And the more deeply we're aware of that, the more we find ourselves in this expanded world, because we're not grasping for form. And it seems to me that one of the biggest things that's missing really from our understanding is, and I say this to relate this to the rest of the dialogues, because we've had a few people who are doing neurophenomenological studies rather on essentially the second noble truth, and science, because we are not interested in first person experience, because essentially respectable academic discourse hasn't touched on first person experience. The second noble truth is more or less invisible to science. And if it were not invisible, it seems to me, but we're accepted as in the culture, we might have a vastly greater chance of living in this world of presence, because we would be able to respectably take on the practice of seeing the suffering that comes from grasping at forms.
Well, yes, a lot to say there. First of all, the second person form is different altogether in kind, isn't it, from first person and third person? Coming back to what I was talking about, there is a kind of grandiosity, or sort of, yes, an overreaching quality to both the aspiration to be third person and to be just first person. We need this bridge. All true discourse has to be second person, and all intellectual life is a form of discourse, which doesn't mean that there aren't truths. There isn't true that we have to give up hope of establishing things that we can all broadly agree on, in an ideal world, of course. I'm a great believer that there are truths to a degree. I mean, nothing is absolute, but some things are truer than others. And it's not just the case that what I say goes, what you say goes, and there we are. So it's a discourse, it's an ongoing process, an idea that I think is very important, not an entity. But the problem of attachment is very interesting for me, because it's the one thing in Buddhism that I may need help with understanding. I think the best understanding I have of it is that not that one should be somehow detached in the sense of untouched by the experience of others and of the world and the suffering of others, that one should therefore not be detached. One would be a kind of monster if one was. But not to allow that to control one to such an extent that it becomes the sort of primary element that colors one's way of interacting with others and the way of being there for the world. So I don't know. I mean, maybe you can help me there, because to me it's very unattractive that one should be wholly unattached. And certainly Jesus was an image of somebody who was not wholly detached and who very clearly suffered with and alongside, which is one of the things I love about the Christian mythos. I mean, a word I use without prejudice as to whether it's true or not. So yes, and I was slightly worried by Brother Faplin's remark, having no point of view, because I don't think that can be done. And I think it might be an illusion that there can be no point of view. I don't want to contradict Buddhist wisdom, but I think that what one ought to do is detach from just one point of view, one's own point of view, and that the richness of objectivity is not to pretend that you don't have a point of view, but to try and see as many points of view as you possibly can. I just throw that out.
Thank you. So I, first of all, about attachment, this is very of interest for me too, because I feel like it's a common sort of misperception of Buddhism in the West, and it might really just be a question of translation of the word sometimes, that I think what is meant is certainly not indifference. There's an enormous emphasis in the Buddhist tradition on compassion, and that really the more we free ourselves from the illusion of separateness, the illusion of that I am me and you are you, and that everything is outside of everything else, then the more we compassion spontaneously arises, and with that a very powerful desire to engage and to relieve that suffering in whatever way we can. So the freedom is really, or the detachment is from detaching from the idea of separateness. It doesn't mean becoming indifferent and detaching ourselves from the world, quite the opposite. Because as soon as we remove that idea of separateness, what happens is that we come more into the world. We are the world and the cosmos, and we recognize this profound interdependence and interconnection of all things. And then how can one not act? How can one say that, how can one not feel then the pain and the suffering of every other living being, and even perhaps beings that that we considered previously to be non-living or inanimate? It's like you feel the pain of the planet, not just of animals and people, but these things, we see that they're part of our flesh and bones. And so it's certainly, for me, the very opposite of indifference that arises as the more that we remove these kind of these views of the views of separateness. Another way to talk about right view. Sorry, Liam, I'll let you come in just a moment. Perhaps before we jump all the way to no view, is a view which is free from the notions of being and non-being. So this would be also another way to characterize right view. And there are several sutras in which this is, a monk goes to the Buddha and says, you speak often about right view, so what is this thing called right view? And he says, well, it is a view that is free from the notions of being and non-being. And I think that is also, it's very, very close to many of the points that you made in the book and in your work about what the right hemisphere is able to hold and able to experience, which is not this kind of forcing things into these categories of either it's there, it exists, or it doesn't exist. And this also has vast implications for how we feel and how we relate to the events of life. For example, death, losing a loved one, or contemplating our own death, or the ideas of disappearance or non-existence after death are really just a manifestation of that idea of being. Now I am, I exist, I'm me, here I am, and after death I will cease to exist. But as soon as we remove these notions and we're able to see that we are just a kind of a weaving of this web. Maybe we're kind of like a focal point in this incredible, endless web of interactions, which includes our actions of body, speech, and mind, which then ripple and continue us, in all dimensions and all directions. We're just part of this sort of field of interactions. And then one can it becomes impossible to identify a beginning point or an ending point in that. There is only continuation, which I think, the more that we cultivate that and translate it from also a notion, because of course we can also grasp at the notion of interbeing, the notion of I get it, no being, no non-being, everything is independent. That can also become a notion and that we can get caught in. But the more that we can experience this as a sort of direct awareness of interconnection and interdependence, then I think that can remove a lot of the fear and suffering and anxiety we have about life and the challenges that we face of death and getting and losing and things coming and going and change and all of these things that we are subject to.
Yeah, just to add briefly to that, also the word detachment has just these connotations in English, like a judge is detached, which probably means they're quite biased towards one person who comes into a courtroom. An Irish person comes into the courtroom and you have to detach. You still have this feeling towards the person, but you're consciously distancing yourself from that. So it has that association, which is just not really what we're talking about at all. It's more also letting go, gently, letting go of expectations, particularly, right? And so when you look at a water fountain and you start expecting something, you lose the beauty. The moment you don't have expectations about water, you get the beauty, right? Anything which is constantly changing in form, your mind knows on a subtle level that it can expect things. That's why water fountains are so beautiful, because you know that you can't realistically hold on to an expectation. You just watch it ripple. And therefore the beauty is kind of open to you, right? And so that's sort of unattachment that we learn on a basic level. It's a bit like when I was a young child, we used to have these little tickets in candy, and the kids we'd get very upset about not getting the candy, the lottery ticket. Whereas I look at the adults, and the adults realize that lottery tickets didn't actually come in; they weren't attached to it, right? So we would get into these little spats about who was going to get the candy prize. It was never going to come. Whereas people with a greater experience realized that it wasn't sure. And you can look at the whole Buddhist reflection as realizing nothing's sure. So being unattached.
I think what we could do as a simple remedy, just a brief parenthesis, would be to replace this idea of detachment with non-grasping.
That would be wonderful.
It's also the grasping that gives rise to so much suffering.
It's the seizing, the wanting to have, to control, to know something, but being open in particular, to unknowing.
Sorry, if I may. The main kind of suffering that arises that we identify in the Buddhist tradition is actually what we call the double grasping, which is the simultaneous creation in our mind of the notion of the subject of perception and the object of perception. And we simultaneously grasp at those two, and we create them in our experience. We invent them, essentially. So this is really also a big cause of suffering, is the double grasping.
Well, that's the opposite of the perception of betweenness.
Right.
And seems exactly what I was saying, that for the left hemisphere there is subject and object. The right hemisphere, it's not that way, because there is a flow. It's the one
Yes.
that perceives flow. An image I find very powerful, because of course it's the central image of Taoism, but it's also the central image of the philosophy of Heraclitus, or one of the more important images in it, who I consider to be the greatest Western philosopher. And recapturing this notion of a flow seems to be important, because rightly or wrongly, I do hear people say in the Buddhist tradition, all is one. And when you realize that all is one, there is no suffering. Now, I admire the peace of mind that enables you to say that. But when I think of the Holocaust, saying all is one doesn't really seem an adequate response, because the business of the cosmos is unifying and particularizing at the same time. The whole business of creation is making individuals that are not separate, but distinguishable, and in that sense distinct. So we have a duty to nurture the bit of the cosmos that is given to us for a while to nurture in our own way. So to transcend or get rid of what is unique to you or me is in a way wrong, but it needs to be taken up into a greater whole in which it is not seen as an indigestible part. The image that I like here is one again from flow, that in every stream that flows there is turbulence. In every turbulence there are whirlpools or vortices. And these are separate elements that are absolutely distinct in the sense that you could photograph them, you can measure them. They have force for a while, but they're never separate from the river. They just are the river in that place at that time. So they're not separable, but they are individual and they're important and they have effects. So I think it's awfully important myself to maintain this balance between, people say to me, all is one, and I say, yes, and all is many, now what? And I think holding both of them together is very good. My favorite Buddhist saying is yes, but, and I don't think there should be any one line that is right. Nagarjuna's saying, neither assert that it is, nor that it is not, nor that it both is and is not, nor that it neither is nor is not. That might be your thing about the place of being and non-being.
Exactly. That's the four sort of positions to refute, and this is exactly this freedom from these notions of being and non-being. And yes, the image of the whirlpool is one that I love very much. I think I first came across it in David Bohm's writings. Wholeness in the Implicate Order. He used the image of a whirlpool, of a vortex in a stream, really to sort of be a metaphor for things that are temporarily identifiable and have characteristics and properties that we can measure, but are clearly have no edge in a sense. They're a continuous part of a bigger whole, and the separateness is only a kind of convenience for the purpose of speech and communication and analysis, and none of those things are bad. It's just that we have to hold that ability to see things as separate and distinct in this wider context of a whole. And yes, I think it's wonderful to please.
The image is also, for those who are interested, in a philosopher 200 years before Bohm, Schelling, who is a neglected, partly because he's quite hard to understand philosopher, but he is, I think, profound and rich, and would take one of the prizes in my pantheon for great philosophers. So anyway, but these images I think are very helpful, because the human mind needs them in order to try and transcend rather rigid modes of operating.
Right. And when it comes to saying that all is one, I think this is what happens. It's sometimes what we refer to in Buddhism as the Zen sickness. When we first come in touch with the ideas of everything's interconnected and isn't it all wonderful, then we might actually just jump to that extreme, which for me is kind of like turning the cosmos into a smoothie. You know, you just put it in the blender and then it's just, you know, but it's not a smoothie. It's interesting. It does have bits that are different and that are beautiful, and each is beautiful in its own way in relation to the whole. And so it's important, you know, as a student of Buddhism, not to get caught in any extreme views, and that would be one. And the Buddha often said, my teaching is like a snake, and if you catch it by the tail, it will bite you. So it's very easy to misunderstand. Yes, I think we're all, as students of Buddhism, in a constant kind of process of trying not to grasp also at the teaching, trying not to reify it as a final explanation of how things are, because that was not what the teaching was meant to be. So the teaching is often referred to as a raft, which helps us to cross from the shore of suffering to the shore of freedom. But then if you keep hold of the raft and you carry it on your head and you become proud of it and you say, I've understood, then actually you just look like a fool because you're carrying a raft around on your head and you're not free at all. And that's another kind of grasping or attachment which limits our freedom. So the point is to make use of the teaching, but then to know when to release it, not to get stuck with it.
Especially as a truth and its opposite will always turn out to be true in certain respects.
Right.
So that, you know, the profound idea of the coincidence of opposites is very, very important one again in my recent work, which doesn't mean that you can say anything and nothing has meaning, not at all. But the deeper things you have to see that they contain within them, they're opposite. Much as you can fall in love with the North Pole of a magnet, but however much you love it, you can't get rid of the South Pole of the magnet. If you cut it off, you've just got a shorter magnet with the South Pole.
Right. But this is almost precisely what, again, it's quite striking, some of the things you say, how close they are to, you know, well-known sayings of our teacher. He would often take a marker in his teaching, and he said, you know, if you look at the right and the left, you can't have the right without the left. And if you try to cut off the left, you take a knife, well, as soon as that place where you cut, then that becomes the left. So you would say that the left is immanent in the right, and the right is immanent in the left, and the two manifest together and can never be separated. And of course, that's just a metaphor too for many, many other things.
Yes. Well, it seems to me that we
say quickly.
There's really no substance differences between us. Sorry, carry on.
Well, I don't know if it's worth exploring. We can edit this, but it seems to me, in response to your "all is one" comment, it's also, I mean, it's very similar in many ways. The Buddhist concept of essentially that some people call it action through inaction, right? Essentially, because you say everything is one doesn't preclude you from being guided towards movement, right? It's a bit like the first time I had a great first introduction to Plum Village, because when we went to walking meditation with Thich Nhat Hanh, bees started stinging everybody. And the people at the back of the line who'd never been to a walking meditation before sat there and got stung by a bee. Whereas Thich Nhat Hanh and all the people at the front of the line just got away from the bees. They didn't continue walking at exactly the same pace as all the rest of the people were trying to sort of think, you know, perform their knowledge of all is one, I suppose. You know, that you're guided to take an action, right? And it's a bit similar to this idea that you discuss in the book, that the right hemisphere can't make complex decisions, right? It sees it all as one, but it people with the right hemisphere are still guided to moral action.
Well, the right hemisphere is particularly good, actually, at conflict situations. So when there is not a straightforward way of understanding something or a straightforward way of resolving something, the right hemisphere is immediately engaged in overdrive, because it's much better at seeing how to negotiate a subtle, complex, self-conflicting whole than the left hemisphere, which keeps meeting a brick wall down every path it goes. So being able to see and hold together these, in a way, opposites without allowing them to collapse into one or the other pole seems to me enormously important. It's that being able to be patient with something that can't now be resolved, that you have to not resolve it by just ruling one of these out, like the mind-body thing, like so many important things in our lives. We can't take, well, we can, but if we do, we forfeited understanding as soon as we've simplified it by just choosing one, which makes life easier for us.
I think this corresponds to a very helpful frame that we can use to look at life. And reality is, within Buddhist teaching, is the concept of the ultimate dimension and the historical dimension. And that often we also make the mistake of confusing the two, or trying to collapse them into one, or trying to say that one is more real than the other. And this is sometimes an artifact, again, of the translation, because when we say ultimate and conventional, or ultimate and historical, it sounds to our Western ears that what we're saying is the ultimate is better or more true in some way. And I remember one question and answer session with our teacher that really kind of comforted me in that sense. And he said the ultimate truth has no right to declare itself to be the only truth or a higher truth than the relative truth or conventional. And that really the two are also woven together and can't be separated. But at the same time, for the purposes of thought and analysis and discourse, we have this other very helpful guideline, which is the separate investigation of noumena and phenomena. That we have to know when we are speaking about one and when we are speaking about the other, and not to mix up the two. Because sometimes it's appropriate to talk about oneness and how you look into a part and you see the whole. But at other times, it's very important to know that there's a level of reality at which things are distinct and have identifiable characteristics and properties, and we can't just claim that one way of seeing dominates the other or is the final answer. We can't collapse them onto each other.
Not perhaps the final answer, but I wonder if the solution has to be that they are of equal importance. Going back to my thing about the master and the hemisphere. So the right hemisphere understands that it needs the left, and the left has value, but the left hemisphere doesn't understand that it needs the right. So the vision that sees the two is different from the vision that sees the one, and it is better than that vision. And so what we need is both union and division. By division, I don't mean ultimately, what I'm talking about, distinctifying. So we need things to be individuated, but we need them still to be connected. And so we need union and we need division, but we need at a meta level the union of union and division. We don't want a division of division.
Right.
So in that sense, union and division are both necessary, but union in a way is more important than division ultimately. So it may be true that the all is one is more important, but it must never do without the all is many. Right. And the problem is when we have to choose one or the other, or when we think that they're only of equal value, because I mean, it's not for me to comment on what you report your master is saying to you, your teacher. But I wonder if when he said the as it were, the ultimate truth has no right to say I'm the only truth, he was pointing to this, that first of all, it's not the only truth, we're agreed. And secondly, it's typical of the master not to say, but I exert my right as master. It's typical of the emissary to say, I exert my right as master wrongly. So it could be that he would still agree that somehow this ultimate truth, whatever you like to call it, can subsume the other truth, but it doesn't annihilate it by subsuming it. It is enriched indeed by subsuming.
Yes.
In the way that what is implicate gets explicated, and it only becomes bad when it then separates. As long as it's kept within the whole, it's enriched the whole.
I love this idea of transcend and include, or transcend and enfold.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that because the quote is not does not have the right to declare itself greater than, right? Which would be a comparison, right?
Okay, yes.
And so this, I think, is where we're getting tripped up here. Is that it does not have the right to declare itself greater than. Then it's already in relatives, and then it would be falsifying its own truth. You see. So I think that would be the source of the difficulty there.
Yeah. Well, that's perfectly, isn't it? That's nice. I like that. Yes.
And the danger, of course, in reporting anything that I said is that I'm probably getting it wrong. So I may be misreporting. And then the other thing is the compassion of the teacher to say something in words, knowing that it cannot actually represent the truth, and that automatically somebody, probably me, is going to misunderstand it and get tangled up in knots. But out of compassion, the teacher still tries to say something, and using metaphor, using poetry, using the sort of finger pointing. So don't look at the finger, look at where I'm pointing. But it's, of course, very easy to misunderstand.
This is very useful to always remember this discourse that ends. I mean, it's not really within our tradition, but as soon as you say anything, you're already in duality, right? And this is always the difficulty, and why so many people misunderstand both our tradition and probably your book. Right. I mean, I always say this, that, part of the reason why the Master and the Emissary may not be better understood is that most books have a viral thesis, have a thesis that can be explained in one line and then argued for the rest of the book. Whereas your book is more like one half of the book is saying something similar, like, be here now. The right hemisphere is the hemisphere that we're talking about when we say be here now, which typically is a full-length book explanation, then describing history through awareness of that, sort of talking about be here now in terms of neurological function, which is not a one sentence thesis that you can just tell somebody and expect them to then see where you're going with it. So it's an extraordinarily demanding tome in that way, similar to the tradition has always been demanding.
Well, the whole culture of the soundbite is the very antithesis of what you've been describing, that as soon as you say something, you're in duality and there's another truth that's being neglected. So the discourse has to be almost infinite. But when one has to nowadays summarize your thesis in the case, what is it called? The lift pitch, the pitch that you make to somebody about your book in the time it takes to go down in the lift. This is not reassuring and not easy. Partly because, of course, an important part of all wisdom, and I know it is of the Buddhist tradition, is that if one knows, then one is wrong. What one knows is wrong. What one begins to know when one knows what it is one doesn't know, which after all is a distinction between the left and the right hemisphere. And probably the most important European mystic in the 15th century was Nicholas of Cusanus, who you may or may not know. He was many things. He was a philosopher and a scientist and a theologian and many other things. But he wrote a book called De Docta Ignorantia, which means about learned ignorance. And this is a kind of ignorance that is the other side of knowing, not the ignorance you have before you start, but the ignorance that you end up with after you've been there. And it's a very rich ignorance. So, and the thing that's lovely about that is that it contains this idea of the growing of knowledge in a kind of, if one has to say it, dialectical way. So at first everything is implicit. And he talks about the explicatio of what is implicatum. So it is then explicated. But that is not a good place to stop, because you only now think you've got something that you know. And what you've done is you've given it to the left hemisphere, and it goes, yeah, I know, I'm on the case, I've got it. It's one of those and two of those, and we put them together and we've got this. Phew. But his next stage is called complicatio, which is not the same as complication. But plicatio means folding, from plicare, to fold. So when things are infolded, they are implicit. When they are unfolded, they are explicit. And when they are folded together, they are complicit or complicated. And that is the third stage, in which this stuff is then taken together into a new whole, which you don't grasp, but which you have acquaintance with. So that is that unfolding taken to another stage. I love that anyway.
It's very beautiful. That's very beautiful. I think that we could find many, many parallels to that in, well, both Bohm, obviously the implicate and the explicate order. And our teacher has spoken a lot about drawing parallels between Bohm's work and Buddhist thought. And also, similarly, the way in which we speak of knowledge in Buddhism as an obstacle to insight, and that actually, of course, there's part of us that wants to accumulate more and more intellectual knowledge, and we think that that will somehow, shore us up. But we learn that to be in contact with life and with the present moment, and with the constant sort of arising of new truths, we have to be able to release that which we hold to be true. Yes. So we are. We're speaking about openness.
About openness and not closing down to what you think to be true or certain. And then that's a very rich element, of course, also in Christianity, in St. Augustine, in Meister Eckhart, and all these wonderful writers, that unknowing and dwelling in the place of emptiness is fulfillment and richness. Because, of course, it's not emptiness as we normally mean it. It's an emptiness which is full of potential. And the more we actualize it into the things we think we know, the more we fill it up with rubbish. There's no room there again. So empty again, and allow the potential to emerge.
Precisely. This is another misperception of Buddhism, that we equate emptiness with non-existence, or with a kind of it's been so sometimes Buddhism gets misunderstood in the West and drifts towards a kind of nihilism, saying that everything is empty and meaningless, and this is very far from what was meant by the teaching on emptiness. And I like what you said about emptiness and fullness, because this again is very close to how our teacher speaks about emptiness, that we when somebody says something is empty, he says we have to ask, empty of what? So he says, Avalokiteshvara, Mr. Bodhisattva, you said everything is empty, but empty of what? And then the Bodhisattva would reply, it's empty of only one thing, which is a separate self. And so whenever we look into anything, in fact, it's full. It's full of the entire cosmos. We look into ourselves, we find our father, our mother, our education, all our ancestors, our culture, the food, the land, the air, the planet, the cosmos itself. There's nothing that, we're only made of non-us elements. And so we are full. We are empty of separateness, and we are full of the entire cosmos.
I'm told that the root of the word shunyata, meaning emptiness, is actually the svi in Sanskrit, which means the what is in the hollow of a seed that is going to grow,
Potential.
which is lovely. Yes. Anyway,
so again, it's a misunderstanding arising from a poor translation.
Yes, probably, yeah. Well, so gosh, we've talked a lot. I'm sure we
have.
Could talk forever. But
yeah,
I think we should draw things to a close.
Yeah.
And it's really it's an honor for us to have you join us in the context of this retreat, and I'm sure that this conversation will be enriching for everyone who participates in it. And so just on behalf of all of us here in Plum Village, I want to express our deep gratitude for you joining us in this moment, but also for the work that you have done and that you do. Yes, and really on a personal note, I just want to express gratitude as well for the kind of what I feel is the depth of compassion and humanity that shines through your work. And for me, it's very it resonates very closely with my own aspiration to try to understand the brokenness potentially of our world, and how one might go about doing whatever we can in our small way to bring a balm to that, and to heal it wherever we can. So thank you very much for all of that.
Thank you very much, and I can't leave without saying I'm almost overwhelmed by such lovely words, and I'm deeply honored also to have been allowed to be with you in this period and to hear your wisdom. And you may or may not know that I originally was going to become a monk, a Christian monk, but I decided in the end not to. I don't think I'd have made a very good one. But I have an enduring, shall I say, deep respect for anyone who adopts such a life. So thank you very much for allowing me to be, for a while, part of your presence, your tradition, and all that you can tell me. Thank you.
Thank you, Iain.
Thank you too.